Picture a man whose name history never bothered to write down. He's a treasurer in an ancient capital, and every morning the same kind of message lands on his desk. Another month in the field, another convoy of grain wagons rolling east, another village of farmers who aren't farming because they're carrying spears. He isn't afraid of the enemy army. He's never even seen it. He's afraid of the ledger in front of him, because he can already read the ending. The general will send back word of a glorious victory, and 3 harvests later, the kingdom that won will quietly stop existing. That man is the real protagonist of the art of war, not the warrior, the accountant, because Sun Tzu's deepest argument was never about how to win a war. It was about how to keep a war from killing the people who win it. There's a pattern hidden inside that ancient book, and once you see it, you can't look away. It's a sequence, 5 stages that quietly convert a war into a self-inflicted bankruptcy. And it repeats with almost mechanical precision across 25 centuries. So, let's do something the slogans never do. Let's test it. We're going to run Sun Tzu's pattern against hard evidence. Against the kingdoms of ancient China that lived or died by it. Against a second civilization that discovered the exact same law on its own. And against 2 modern superpowers that marched into the identical trap, in the identical country, 2,500 years apart. Before we walk through any of it, you need to understand what fiscal exhaustion actually looks like, because it almost never looks like losing. It looks like winning, slowly, while quietly going broke. Sun Tzu compressed the whole danger into one line. There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. He didn't mean that as wisdom. He meant it as arithmetic. And the arithmetic moves in 5 stages. Stage 1, the insecurity trap. A state feels threatened, mobilizes, and the meter starts running the instant the army moves. Stage 2, the sunk cost spiral. The war drags. And instead of cutting losses, leaders pour in more. Precisely because they've already spent so much. Stage 3, the treasury drain. The productive economy gets eaten to feed the front. Fields go unworked. Capital that could have compounded just evaporates. Stage 4, the reckless gamble. The state can no longer afford the stalemate, so it throws away caution for one desperate roll of the dice. Stage 5, the hollow collapse. The war technically ends, and then the state falls anyway, not to the enemy, to the bill. Hold those 5 in your head. We're about to watch 3 different powers walk through every single one. Start in the 3rd century BCE, deep in China's warring states era. The world Sun Tzu actually wrote for. Around 260 BCE, 2 of the great powers, Qin and Zhao, collided over a contested commandery at a place called Changping. And it's the perfect autopsy, because Zhao's commander, a veteran named Lian Po, understood Sun Tzu perfectly. He refused to fight. He dug in, fortified, and waited, betting that Qin, whose supply lines ran much farther over much harder ground, would bleed itself dry first. For roughly 3 years it worked. Both armies sat across a river while the real battle ran between 2 treasuries. But a stalemate is expensive for the defender too, and that's stage 4 arriving on schedule. Back in the capital, the Zhao court couldn't stomach the cost of doing nothing, so they pulled Lian Po, the man whose patience was actually winning, and replaced him with a younger, aggressive general, Zhao Kuo, who marched out to force a decisive battle. Qin's commander feigned weakness, drew the Zhao army into the open, severed its supply line, and encircled it. After 46 days without food, the trapped soldiers surrendered. What happened next is the number that should stop you cold. According to Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, the Zhao side lost on the order of 450,000 men, with the chronicle recording that a further 400,000 captives did not survive its aftermath. Zhao was never a serious power again. It had done everything Sun Tzu warned against. It let the cost of the war dictate its strategy instead of the other way around. And it lost not a battle, but its future. Now look at the winner, because the contrast is the entire lesson. Why could Qin afford the stalemate Zhao couldn't? Because Qin had spent the previous century building fiscal capacity instead of incinerating it. After Xiangyang's reforms beginning around 356 BCE, Qin reorganized into a centralized, tax-extracting, merit-rewarding machine. And then it did something Sun Tzu would have applauded. Here's the part nobody tells you. A rival state, Han, tried to sabotage Qin by tricking it into an enormous, ruinously expensive irrigation project, the Zhengguo Canal, specifically hoping the cost would, in Sima Qian's words, dissipate Qin's energies and keep it too broke to invade. The scheme was an explicit attempt to bankrupt a rival through a forced construction project. It backfired spectacularly. The canal, completed in 246 BCE, irrigated roughly 27,000 square kilometers of new farmland and turned Qin into the breadbasket that fed the armies which unified China 15 years later. And there's your first new angle, the distinction the aphorism hides. It was never spending that killed states. It was the kind of spending. Han assumed a giant infrastructure bill would drain Qin the way a war does. But productive spending compounds. It builds capacity that pays for itself. War spending evaporates. Think of it like a household. A family that borrows to buy a workshop ends up richer, while the family next door that borrows the exact same sum to feud with the neighbors ends up bankrupt. Same debt, opposite fate. That line, between capital that grows and capital that burns, is the line between solvency and collapse. And almost nobody draws it correctly until it's too late. Now, you could argue this is just one culture's idea. So here's where it gets genuinely strange. Roughly a century after Sun Tzu, on the far side of the Himalayas, an Indian strategist named Kautilya, chief advisor to the founder of the Mauryan Empire, sat down and wrote his own manual of statecraft, the Arthashastra. He had almost certainly never heard of Sun Tzu, and he arrived at the identical conclusion. Kautilya built his theory of the state around 7 elements and placed the kosha, the treasury, at the center as the single most vital one, because every other function of the state depended on it. He warned in a line that could have been pulled from a modern central bank memo, "A king with a depleted treasury eats into the very vitality of the citizens and the country." And on war specifically, he was almost a cost accountant. Wherever the expected return from peace and from war are roughly equal, his calculus falls unambiguously on the side of peace, because war exacts 3 costs that peace does not: troops lost, treasury drained, and productive capacity bled out in the field. Sit with that. 2 civilizations, separated by mountains and language and 100 years, independently reduce the art of war to the same equation. The enemy in front of you is rarely your biggest threat. Your own balance sheet is. When 2 thinkers reach the same answer with no contact between them, that's not a slogan anymore. That's a law. And if a law that old is doing something to your view of strength, good. That's the whole reason to keep going. Because the unsettling part is that the law is still running. Fast forward about 2,300 years to December 1979. The Soviet Union, a nuclear superpower, sends its army into Afghanistan. Stage 1, the insecurity trap. A wobbling client government, a nervous border, a decision that looks cheap on day 1. Stages 2 and 3 arrive over the next decade. The war curdles into an unwinnable stalemate against U.S. armed insurgents, and the cost compounds. Not catastrophic on any single page, but relentless. Estimates put the direct burden at roughly $2 to $3 billion a year. A 1987 CIA estimate reckoned Afghanistan consumed only about 2.5% of annual Soviet military spending. By the headline figure, the USSR could afford it. Mikhail Gorbachev didn't see it that way. He called the war a bleeding wound, and he meant the political and economic drain as one thing. Here's the cost paradox, and it's the second new angle. The invoice was survivable. The opportunity cost was not. The war landed at the worst possible moment. The global oil price collapse of 1985 to 86 cut Soviet hard currency earnings, which came almost entirely from energy exports, by roughly half. A state already overspending on a Cold War arms race, already absorbing the financial wreckage of Chernobyl, now had a foreign war it could neither end nor justify. And historians genuinely argue about how decisive Afghanistan was. The historian Sergei Radchenko notes the direct cost was modest against a Soviet military budget of around $128 billion. But that is the point. States don't fall because one line item is unpayable. They fall because the line items stack. Because resilience erodes quietly until a system that looks solvent on Monday is gone by Friday. The Soviet Union withdrew in 1989. It ceased to exist in 1991. And now the part that turns history into a warning. Because the very next superpower to march into Afghanistan brought a calculator that confirmed every word of it. The United States invaded in 2001 and left in 2021, and we have the receipts, line by line, courtesy of the Costs of War project at Brown University. The direct tab came to roughly $2.3 trillion over 20 years. President Biden, citing those researchers, framed it as more than $300 million a day, every day, for 2 decades. And here's the detail that is pure Sun Tzu. About $530 billion of that total was interest on the money borrowed to fight, a war financed on a credit card, with the balance still compounding long after the last soldier flew home. The project has estimated that interest on war borrowing could swell to around $6.5 trillion by the 2050s. So let's run the checklist Sun Tzu himself would have run. Did the state enter without pricing the long-term economic strain? Check. Did it keep pouring in resources because it had already spent so much? The sunk cost spiral? Check. Did it finance the war with debt that compounds against future taxpayers? Check. Did the conflict end without buying the strategic outcome it was supposed to buy? Check. 2 superpowers. 1 country, the one historians literally nicknamed the graveyard of empires. The same 5 stages, 2,300 years after Sun Tzu wrote them down, and somehow neither one had read the book. If watching 2 superpowers fail the same open book exam is doing something to you, subscribe. We trace these patterns every week, and unlike a defense budget, it costs you nothing. So, where does that leave us right now? Here's the uncomfortable part. The pattern no longer needs a declared war to run. Look at what Sun Tzu would actually be measuring in the great powers of this decade. Defense budgets climbing while debt loads climb faster. The long compounding cost of projecting force across an entire planet. Supply chains so fragile that a single choke point can do what an army used to do. The instruments have changed. Sanctions, cyber operations, proxy conflicts, deterrence. And notice that every one of them exists for the precise reason Sun Tzu predicted. They are cheaper than armies. The states that understand that are quietly conserving capital. The ones that don't are running the meter and calling it strength. Sun Tzu wouldn't recognize the technology. He'd recognize the math in an instant. His real lesson was never that the strong nation wins. It's that the solvent nation outlasts. And that a victory means nothing if the treasury collapses the morning after. 3 powers walked through all 5 stages. Each was certain it was the exception. The pattern has never once cared. Maybe this time is different. Maybe a great power finally reads the ledger before it reads the casualty report. But the record says otherwise. History doesn't really repeat itself so much as it keeps mailing you the same invoice over and over, until somebody finally opens it. If you want to see which power reaches the next stage first, subscribe. Because when the bill comes due, you'll want to have seen it coming. I read the receipts, so you don't have to.